Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're tackling a project that's been on my mind for a while, crafting a stainless sandmite boning knife. We're keeping this one classy with a Damascus core surrounded by the practicality of stainless steel. And for a little bling, we'll be adding a brass guard and bright pink stabilized wood handle. If that sounds like something you're into, please hang around to see how this all came together. First things first, we're kicking this one off by prepping our materials. We'll start by slicing off a chunk of 420 stainless round bar using the bandsaw. This stuff is tough. I don't know what's in it, but I can't help but feel like it's taken a good chunk of life out of my bandsaw blade. But with our chunk cut, I'll light the forge and get this one up to forging temperature. Now I know I don't have the biggest press in the world, but this stuff is like trying to forge concrete. I can only take really small bites and I'm really relying on the smallest surface area of my drawing dies to make this stuff move. But with a little persistence, I've got this one forged down into a bit of a billet, approximately 4mm or about 5/16 of an inch thick. The reason I'm forging this one before making my Damascus is that I want a bit of a guide on how wide I want my finished Damascus billet to be, so these all fit together with minimal trimming. But now that we have our stainless ready, I'll pop over and get to work on the Damascus that's going to make up our core. So I'll start off with 20 layers of alternating 1084 and 15N20 and get them welded together. Then with a work stick attached, we can light the forge and bring this one up to forge welding temperature. We're going to move through the first couple of welds reasonably quickly today. I'm sure no one wants to sit here and listen to me babble all day. So we'll get the first weld set in the press and then rotate the billet 45 degrees and forge a little in on the corners. With the corners pushed in, I'll rotate the billet another 45 degrees and forge it down to form a C shape on the end of the billet. The pattern we are making today is called crushed W's, which we're going to make by building up layers of these C's. And with our first round of forge welding done, I'll leave it to cool down enough for us to be able to handle it. It's later in the day and the billet is cooled enough for us to work with, so I'll lock it up in the vise and rip off all that forge scale. Then I'll mark it out into 5 equal length pieces and get it over to the bandsaw. That hunk of stainless has definitely done a number on my blade. These cuts were pretty slow, but I don't have a spare, so it'll have to do. You could also do this with an angle grinder and a cutoff wheel, but the bandsaw blade is a fair bit thinner, meaning we lose a lot less material from the kerf of the blade, and for me, is a little more accurate. With our pieces cut, I'll tack them together again with the welder and get them back into the forge. This round of forge welds is pretty well the same as the last. We're simply wanting to reduce our stack down to a long bar for another stack. So we'll start off nice and gentle and then start feeding the pressure in as the billet gets consolidated. Then we can stretch it out into a nice long billet, ready for our second restack. So I feel like I'm doing the same thing over and over a little bit here. What's that saying about doing the same thing over and over again? But that's looking like it's down where we need it to be, so I'll leave it to cool overnight and get ready for another stack in the morning. It's the next day, and who doesn't love a little angle grinding with their morning coffee? I'll get the scale ripped off and cut up into 5 pieces again. We can see here that the pattern's coming along and should only get better as we increase our number of W's. So again, I'll tack these 5 together and get them into the forge. This is the last restack, and I did think to myself, I'll take the work stick off so I can work on the billet from all sides, but I don't have quite the right tongs for that job, and this has just become a master level game of hot potato. But I'll struggle through and get the billet down to the same height as our piece of stainless from yesterday, and it can sit to cool. When it's cool enough to touch, I'll set it up jankily in the bandsaw and cut off a slice about 12mm or half an inch thick. And with a quick trip to the grinder to clean up the surfaces, we can see the pattern that should peek out along our cutting edge. Now we can bring this one together again with the pieces of stainless. I've made sure that the mating surfaces are pretty clean here, as stainless can be pretty picky about being clean. But they are close enough to head over to the welder and weld this one up tight around all the edges. We need to keep this as an oxygen-free environment, as any oxidization forming between the layers will stop the stainless from sticking to our Damascus core. And back into our forge we go for our last round of forge welds. I'll bring this one up to a nice yellow heat and gently set the weld. And then we can work away at getting this down to a thinner billet that will be closer to the thickness of our finished knife. I'm not going to be forging this knife to shape, as I'm not confident that I can get it done without shearing the welds, but as long as we can get it reasonably close to the finished thickness that I'm chasing, I'll be able to stock removal the knife from there. But that's looking close enough to me, so I'll leave this one to cool. With the billet cooled enough to handle, I can get to work on the profile. I'm shooting for something around the 17cm or 7" mark for this one. For the design of this knife, I'm looking for something with an upswept tip. I don't see a huge amount of handmade boning knives in the style that I have in mind, but this one is heavily influenced by Don Wen's style. I never seem to be able to draw exactly what I want, but it's close enough to whiz off the excess with an angle grinder. With the excess removed, we can head over to the belt grinder and refine the shape down to close to what I'm looking for. I'll also bring down the thickness a little. It's not necessary on this combination of steels, as the stainless on the outsides won't harden, but I have had issues before getting the core material in stainless sand mire to harden properly, so this will give me a little insurance that the core will cool quick enough in the quench to harden through. But with our little blank prepped, I'll pop this one into the kiln and bring it up to critical temperature, and then quench it in oil. And yep, for anyone paying close attention, I did drop this one and spend the next 15 minutes fishing the knife out of the bottom of my quench tank. But with our quench done, I'll give this one a temper and head over to the grinder. Something cool about this construction is that you don't even really need to mark a center line. I'll simply grind into the core material, being extra careful to keep everything as straight as possible. I should make smaller knives more often. The combination of working on a thinner knife with non-hardened stainless on the outside makes this a breeze. And with the grinding done, I want to cut in a little notch that will make sharpening easier. I don't do this often, but because this knife won't have a heel and it's butted up tight against the guard, I want to leave a little space, so I don't scratch up my brass in the future when sharpening. I think that looks like about what we need, so now I can get onto the hand sanding. Again, this small knife thing is great. I'll buzz over the surfaces with a 400 grit to smooth everything out and then move up to 600. The jacket material is going to come out of the acid with quite a matte finish, so I don't need to worry about going too high up in the grits for this one. With the hand sanding done, I'll wrap this one up and get to work on the handle pieces. I'll start by knocking off a chunk of brass with an angle grinder. Then mark out the surface with a marker so I can see my scribe lines a little clearer. Then using the height of my tang as a guide, mark out some rough lines where I'll make my slot. I have a perfectly good scribe just out of shot here, but for some reason I thought ruining the tips of my calipers was a better idea. But with the brass marked out, I'll pop over to the mill and get this slot cut. I'll lock it down in the mill vise, and using a carbide slot cutting bit, I'll nibble my way through, taking pretty light passes. You don't need a mill for something like this. For the longest time, I used to drill a series of holes in a line with a drill press, and then file them down into a slot. But a mill does make really quick work of this, and gives a lot cleaner slot when it comes time to get a really nice fit up around the tang. These tapered end mills are pretty cool for this job. I always used to use the smaller straight shanked end mills, but they break a lot, and the little recess on the handle side of the slot gives a little extra pocket for the epoxy to go into. With the slot cut, I can pop over to the grinder and clean up the faces on a Trizac belt, and get to giving this thing some shape. I probably don't need to cut this little radius in before gluing up, but in my mind I feel like having a little guide to work to can't be a bad thing. And then I'll give it a rough elliptical shape by eye. But before moving on to the glue up, I want to polish the front face of this guard, as I won't be able to get to it after the handle's glued on. So with a little compound on the hard wheel, I'll give this thing a little bling. Pink is the name of the game today. I had a look around my wood collection and thought this one would be best to complement our little blingy bit of brass. So I'll make a mortise in the block and scrape out any excess with a broaching tool until our handle fits on nice and snug. With all our handle pieces together, just a few more little touches on the blade. Starting with cutting in the tip. Now I could have done this earlier, but several times in my life I have broken or washed the tip of a knife out through the finishing process. So for me, cutting it in a little later makes sure it stays nice and crisp. And then I'll cut in a little Spanish notch with a round file to help with the sharpening I mentioned earlier. And the last step before the acid, I'll add in a little maker's mark with my worn out stencil that's starting to blow out, and off to the acid we go. I'll give this one 3 cycles at 15 minutes each to make the pattern really stand out. And it's looking pretty cool. The pattern is looking pretty dramatic, and we have a good blend of the stainless jacket material combined with the bold Damascus core. But now that we've had a little peek, it's time to wrap this one up safe and get the handle glued up. As always, we'll mix up a little G-Flex with a little black pigment. I'll fill the cavity in the handle block and coat all the mating surfaces and bring the pieces together. And then into clamps to leave this one overnight to fully cure, and get that handle finished up in the morning. Good lord, this thing is spraying pink dust everywhere. I'm going to be finding it for months. I know I should have better dust collection in here, but it's not something I've gotten around to doing, so I guess I just have to make peace with the fact that the room is probably going to be pink for quite some time. I'll reduce the size of the block down a little and get it in line with the blade, and then trace on a rough profile of my handle. For the shape on this one, I'm going to do something that will be comfortable no matter how you hold it, and I'll encourage the hand to snug up against that finger guard. I'll set the contours on a large contact wheel for a rough shape, and then switch over to the slack J-Flex belt to round everything out. Before heading to the hand sanding, I noticed that there's a fair few little holes in the wood that we use for the handle, so I'll fill them all with super glue and get this one hand sanded up to 1500 grit. With all the sanding done, I'll give it a lick on the buffer to bring the handle finish up and take all the fine scratches out of that brass. And would you look at that, my fit and finish isn't too bad. I was worried about getting a good transition between the brass and the handle material, but it looks like we've pulled it off. And we're on to the finishing touches. I'll mix up a fresh batch of coffee, and I didn't even spill that much today, and get the blade in to bring up the contrast. I would usually edit this out, but for some reason it felt funny to me. I do this process of putting blades into a tank quite regularly and placing a clamp on it to keep the handle at the right height. But every now and then, for some reason, a common task can be a real struggle, and today is one of those days. And there we go, this thing turned out pretty cool. I'm super excited to put it to work. It's stabby, pointy, and feels great in the hand. I'm pretty confident that this is going to be a welcome addition to the other knives in the Nomad kitchen. This is a style I'd love to make another version of in the future. If that's something you would like to see, please give the video a like and hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching everyone, see you on the next one!